Couching is a really fun and easy embellishment technique that basically has endless options for customization because you can choose whatever medium you want to couch with and all of the basic threads and yarn that you want to use to do whatever effect you want. So let's start by talking about what tools you're going to need to start couching. You're going to need the backing fabric, so choose whatever fabric you want and just be aware of the weight of the fabric. So for this fabric, this is kind of a medium weight fabric, and I've decided to use a little bit of stabilizer to give it some stability, because when you're couching the medium that you're using, you don't want it to sink too far into the fabric. But if you're using a heavier weight like felt, then you might not even need stabilizer. But in this case, I've got kind of a medium weight stabilizer to match the fabric. The next thing you're going to need to decide is what medium you want to use to couch onto the fabric. So you have tons of options for that, and that's one of the really fun things about it. So you can use any sort of decorative thread or any kind of decorative yarn. So here's a pearl cotton. So you could do a really narrow type of trim using the pearl cotton and couch using a really tiny stitch. You could also use a lot of these really cool metallic cords. So I've got several varieties of that, and they have a more flat texture that would lay more flat against the fabric. This one has a little bit of another flat one that looks good on garments because it doesn't stand out too much. And then I've got a couple other metallic varieties, and then another really fun thing to play with is yarn. So yarn, as you know, comes in tons and tons of fun types. So this is a variegated type, so that is a good one to use when you're doing free motion couching because you can create an effect of variation all over the fabric, just depending on what color the yarn is showing at that point. You've also got a lot of metallic varieties that have this pretty shiny thread woven through the yarn. And then we've also got a lot of these really cool novelty yarns. So this is a really funny one that has pom-poms built into it. So you can see what kind of cool effects you can make using that for trim on a garment or an accessory or a home deck project. So the next thing you need to decide after you've picked your backing fabric and the medium that you want to use is you need to decide what type of thread to use to couch the yarn on depending on the effect that you want. So if you want the effect to be really subtle, you can use an invisible thread or a monofilament thread. And so monofilament thread comes in both black or smoke colored and clear. So it just depends on the color of what you're couching onto the fabric, what type of transparent clear thread you want to use. So if you're using a darker yarn, then you can use this black thread that will show up a lot less than the clear, just depending on what you're using. And then you can use a basic foot for couching, but you can also find a lot of cool varieties of specialty feet that are designed specifically for couching. So these are really fun to use because they hold the yarn in place for you and you don't have to worry about a lot of shifting as you're going, as you're sewing the yarn or whatever medium you're using onto the fabric. So this foot, for example, has this little hole that goes through the front of it, and you can thread the yarn through it, and that will hold that in place. And you can see there's kind of a room for a zigzag stitch that goes before it hits the yarn, so that holds that in place. And here's another one, and this one is for a really narrow cord, so you can see it just slides right underneath this little tab here that holds the yarn, and again, it stitches it as you're going, stitches down the cord that's in front of it. This is another couching foot that's designed specifically for doing free motion stitching. So if your machine has the capability to drop its feed dogs and you can move the fabric wherever you want, then this is a really fun foot to use because you can thread the yarn through this little hole. It even comes with a special threader to make that process easier to thread the yarn through or whatever medium you're using. And then you can set your machine to a free motion setting, and then it allows you to couch the yarn or whatever all over the fabric. And some, in this case, this is a set, and it comes with one that has a narrower hole and one for a wider hole, just depending on the thickness of your medium. And then, and also something cool that comes along with a set, if you find a set of couching feet, is sometimes they also come with a design that you can use that is a template that you can basically follow to couch if you don't feel like just coming up with your own design. So I'm just going to start out by doing some basic couching using a basic foot and a zigzag stitch. So I'm not going to need any special tools in this case for this. I've threaded the machine with a clear monofilament thread, and this is the clear variety, not the smoke variety, because I think it'll show up less against the yarn that I've chosen. Another option is you can always use, if you don't have monofilament thread on hand, you can also always use a thread that's a similar color to the yarn that you are couching on. So I've got kind of a medium-sized yarn, and I've got my setting for my machine. I've got it set on a zigzag stitch, just a basic zigzag stitch. And in this case, I've figured out that the width of the yarn is going to be compatible with a 6mm wide zigzag stitch. So you always just want to test and play with it beforehand to decide how wide of the stitch is that you need, because you want it to be able to kind of hold the yarn in place securely, but also not necessarily stitch right inside of the yarn. So you just want it like a tiny, tiny bit wider than the yarn that you're using. And then you also don't want it too tight, so you don't want it too narrow, because you want to be able to see the yarn beneath it. So just use a stitch length that is secure, but also you're able to see what you're couching onto the fabric. So in this case, I'm using a 4mm wide zigzag stitch that's, like I said, 6 millimeters wide and 4mm long. So I've marked on my fabric the line where I want to couch. So you don't always have to do that if you're kind of doing a free-form couching project, but if you're really specifically wanting the couching to run right parallel to a seam or something of that nature, then you might want to mark it first just so you have a guide to follow. So I'm just going to set my yarn in place right on the line, right centered above it. And then I'm also going to place the yarn underneath the presser foot and just make sure that my needle swing is hitting the edge of the yarn. If you're using a really, really lofty yarn that's really fat, then you might want to reduce the presser foot pressure as you couch, just so it doesn't smush it too much into the fabric. But in this case, it's kind of a lightweight yarn, so I don't really need to alter my presser foot pressure. So it's very simple. You just are going to go ahead and you can hold it in place. I don't even bother with pinning it, because you can kind of guide the yarn as you stitch. So we're just going to go ahead and stitch along. And I'm just keeping my yarn centered along my line. And I'm just going to make sure that the needle swing is hitting both edges. So we've got the yarn couched now, and you can see that, get this out of the way for a sec, you can see that it has sort of disappeared into the fabric, and you don't really see the monofilament thread, but you can see what you've couched on there, and the zigzag stitch holds it in place. So there's a lot of other fun things that you can do with couching, just depending on how you vary the thread that you use or the fabric that you use behind it. So there's a lot of different options, and also you can use decorative stitches. So you've basically got endless combinations to use. So I'll just show you a couple here. So in this case, I used a variety of different narrower medium than yarn. So this is a really fine metallic cord, and I've used the monofilament thread so you can't see it, and a really narrow zigzag stitch. In this option, I've actually put multiple cords together just so that it makes a thicker width, and so you can customize that however you want. You could put as many cords aligned next to each other as you want. And here I've used this pearl cotton thread that has a little bit more of that sort of handmade look to it, because you can see the texture of the thread in there. And I've also used the monofilament thread in that case. Here's a couple other options. In this option, I used a matching thread and a zigzag stitch to hold this yarn in place. In this one, I used a decorative stitch. So you can choose a decorative stitch on your machine, whichever. It's really fun to kind of play with those options. You probably don't want to use one that's too dense, because obviously it'll start to cover up the yarn that you're using. So in this one, I used kind of a sort of sparser decorative stitch that has a zigzag motion to it, so it holds the yarn in place. And in this option, I just used the monofilament thread, so you can get a little bit more of the effect of the sparkly parts that are in the yarn. It's also really fun to play with all of the different yarns that you can get. So in this one, I've used some of that pom-pom yarn that I showed earlier. So that you can see would be a cool trim to put around maybe a fun pillow or something for a kid, or even like a costume would be a cool use for that. And it gives you an effect that is a lot harder than it actually is to accomplish. It looks harder than it is. And in this one, I've used kind of a yarn that has some metallic and some fringe elements to it. So you just have to experiment and see what looks fun to you and what effect you want. So next I'm going to show you how to couch multiple cords in place to get kind of the look of a braid, and you can use a decorative stitch with that. And so I'm just going to set up the machine for that stitch. So if you want to use a finer medium to couch with, then one thing that might come in handy is a foot that's designed specifically for finer materials like cording. So in this case, I created this kind of cool braid effect on the fabric just by using a foot that's designed for 3 cords at once. And this is the cording that I use. So it's a metallic cord that is fairly narrow. And it's cool to use one of these feet just because it holds it in place for you, so you don't have to try and keep them from getting tangled as you're stitching. And it makes almost like a braid effect. And in this example, I used 2 blue cords on the outside and a silver one in the middle, and set the machine to a decorative stitch to hold them in place. So I have that set up right here, and I've just selected a decorative stitch on my machine that I've tested to be the right width and the right effect that I want to couch these cords in place. And as you can see, there's 3 cords, and I've set them up in the foot, so the foot has 3 slots for the cords. And I'm just going to kind of guide them as I stitch, and the decorative stitch will stitch in front of them, and they'll all stay in place as I'm stitching, which is really makes it easy to create this effect. And it's kind of a good way to create kind of a custom trim for a jacket. It would look cool on a jacket sleeve or on the hem of a skirt or something like that. So let's go ahead and see how this works. So you can see that it is just nicely stitching over the cording for me and holding it in place. I barely have to guide it at all, actually, because it just goes ahead and stitches over them. And so again, you want to choose a decorative stitch that's not too dense because you don't want to cover up the whatever pretty medium that you're using. For this effect, I'm actually using a coordinating thread. I'm not using the invisible thread in this case because I want it to show up. I don't want it to disappear against the fabric. So we just have this little section stitched down here, and it's created this cool kind of custom braided and stitched effect on the fabric. So another really fun use for couching that creates kind of a patch effect around an applique is to couch a narrow material like pearl cotton around an applique. So you've probably stitched a satin stitch around an applique before, but you can do this if you want it to look really finished, and it kind of looks like a patch that's sewn onto the fabric because it has a little bit of raised texture because it shows up underneath the stitching. The pearl cotton creates a little bit of dimension. So for this sample, I've kind of already gotten it started. So you can see that I have the pearl cotton that I've just laid along the edge of the fabric of the applique. And I've stitched part of the way already, but we'll just take a look at how to do that a little bit further. So I'm just going to switch to my regular foot. You could also use a couching foot that's designed for narrow materials. And I'm just going to select a zigzag stitch on the machine. And in this case, I'm going to select a zigzag stitch that I can make into a satin stitch. So let's see here. We want to do a very, very narrow and very short zigzag stitch, so it'll create that really tight effect around the edge. So I'm just going to adjust this down as narrow as I can get it. So in this machine, that's a 0.4 millimeters. And then I'm also going to reduce the width to the right width for my couching material. So in that case, it's a 2.5 millimeter. I'll hit the edges of the couching medium. So I'm going to just test it out first, test out the zigzag to see if it's hitting where I want it to. So it looks like you can always do this first before you actually stitch. So it looks like I've got it in the right place. Before you actually stitch with the petal, you can always test out your satin stitch first. So I'm going to just use my left hand to hold the couching medium in place, and then I'm just going to kind of guide it and keep it taut by holding it behind it, and just go ahead and stitch over. And it's really not too difficult to hold that in place as you go. And it creates a really nice raised effect, a really tidy effect along the edge of an applique. So I'm just going to show you a little project that I did using couching that is just a fun way to test it out and try out some of the couching settings or the feet that you have on your machine for couching. So for this project, it's just a little coaster, but you could also use this technique to make a whole placemat or a mug rug or something like that. I've just used twill tape cut into these short lengths, and I'm going to just, you just couch a piece of yarn along each seam that you've abutted. So twill tape is nice because both edges are already finished. So you can just line them up next to each other, place the yarn over that abutted edge, and then zigzag in place, and it'll catch the yarn and both edges of the twill tape in the same step. So I've just done that with these 5 rows of twill tape, and then I couched another piece of yarn on both ends, and then I frayed the ends a little bit above that. So the fraying will stay in place because it's stitched right there for the couching. So last, let's take a look at how to couch by hand, because you can also use couching for any kind of hand embroidery project if you want to add some texture and dimension, or you want something bolder than just the look of embroidery floss on a couched project. So in this case, I'm using some of the same yarn I used for the machine technique, and I have it kind of held taut here in an embroidery hoop. And you can use any hand stitch that you want, so you could also use a whip stitch, and in this case I'm going to be using a blanket stitch, and I'm kind of holding the yarn in place too inside of the hoop, but you could also draw a line or something of that nature to guide you as you couch along. So I'm using this matching pearl cotton to stitch it down so it doesn't disappear against the couched yarn. So I'm just going to do a really simple buttonhole stitch. And I've got kind of a bigger needle here too because I'm using this this pearl cotton to stitch it down. So I've got a larger embroidery needle. So I'm just going to do this basic buttonhole stitch where you catch the loops as you go, and that will hold the yarn in place just in the same way that we were doing on the machine. So you could also do this on a garment as well, not just on an embroidery project, but you could add this if you wanted a sort of a more handmade look. You could add this to a jacket, to the hem, or maybe around the edge of a pillow. And it's just whatever stitch you prefer to use for hand embroidery. So I'll show you last just something that I made using the free motion setting on the machine. So this is a fun effect where I just used one color of yarn on felt, and I just free motion stitched it in place, and you can see that you can make all kinds of loops and use the machine to guide it as it goes. So this would be kind of a fun way to make a pillow front or decorate any kind of garment with this free motion effect if your machine has that setting. So that's the basics of couching, and I hope you find lots of fun ways to embellish your projects.